Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar on regulatory landscape of cell gene therapies and ATMPs. We're going to wait a couple of minutes for people to gather and then get started. So bear with us for a couple of moments. Okay, I want to give it one more minute and then we start. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, even perhaps. Thank you for joining Celligent's webinar on the regulatory landscape of cell gene therapies and advanced therapy medicinal products. Katja, can you go to the next slide, please? So today I'll be hosting this webinar. I'm Maurice Banchi. I'm Principal SME and Head of Regulatory Affairs at Celligent. And Katja Lonsdale, who is one of our consultants at Celligent, is going to actually deliver the webinar. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Celligent, about the pharmaceutical division. I specifically mention pharmaceutical division because we also have a medical device division. But Celligent is all about providing a comprehensive range of tech-empowered services for the biotech and pharma companies that are seeking regulatory support to increase quality and reduce timeline and costs. And on the right-hand side, you see one of our tech solutions that can help companies such as Captis, Dosplorer, and Describer. Our services are improved by these advanced in-house technologies and those support experienced subject matter experts, enabling them to consistently deliver first-time right and high-quality results. The next slide, please. So the agenda for today is kind of self-explanatory. We start with an overview, dive a little bit in the existing regulations, look at definitions and classifications, and a little bit about the actual development and registration of ATMPs, and end with a Q&A. So I want to remind you that this session is being recorded and that after the webinar, a recording can be made available. And if you have any questions, on the bottom of your screen in Zoom, there's a Q&A tab. Please add your questions there and we'll get to them at the end of the session. Thank you and enjoy this webinar. Katja, over to you.
Next slide. Right, so hold on a sec. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katja Lonsdale. I'm a consultant at Celligence, and I'll be presenting the remaining of the slides to you. So the overview of the presentation today is to give you a very brief and overarching summary of advanced therapy medicinal products. As some of you may already been involved with this product, it comprises of a category of innovative but very complex biological products, which in most cases require very extensive development plans, not only at CMC level, but also preclinical and clinical development plans. It is this complexity that makes it more challenging to get products to market. Although he has been a good part of 2 decades since ATMPs have started being discussed both at EU and US level, only in recent years, 2009 for the EU and 2012 for the US, we actually seen the first ATMPs entering the market. If I was to compare the experience that you would have building up a development plan that runs you through development, registration, and maintenance of small molecules, antibodies, and ATMPs, you will see that from small molecules to antibodies, there is an increase of this complexity that I'm referring to. But further, as you go through developing ATMPs, you'll see that complexity is a lot more extensive, meaning that there's also a lot more associated costs in developing ATMPs. And this is why you don't see ATMPs entering either EU or US market as readily as you will see other type of drugs. The slide deck that you see in front of you is what I describe as a roadmap to the drug development of ATMPs, both at US and EU level. And it is this roadmap that is going to guide me through to the presentation today. So we will touch base on all these key elements that you will need to consider if you are considering the development of ATMPs, both at EU and US, or you are a CRO that are supporting a client in generating a development plan for ATMPs. And I'll run you through all these different elements. And at the end of the presentation, I'll bring you back to the slides so we can actually wrap up and make a summary of these key contributors on the ATMPs drug development plans. The first slide, I'm going to run you through regulation and legislations. They are in place. Until recently, we didn't have neither EU or US level anything that governed specifically ATMPs products. But now in the EU, we have Directive 2001/83, which relates to medicinal products for human use. And there is specific definitions regarding medicinal products, inclusive of ATMPs as well. And you also have specific information in relation to the dossier descriptions, namely Annex 1 and Part 5. You also have Regulation 1394/2007, which is more specific to ATMPs, which has been amended over the last few years. It is likely that if you look at the date 2004, it's likely that now that we are seeing more ATMPs entering the market, that this regulation will incur another amendment. And we also have a transplantation and other cell tissue legislations that you will need to consider depending on your type of product. So it might not be applicable to all drug development, but something for you to consider is the tissue and the cells legislation, the technical requirements for donation, procurement, and testing, and the organ transplantation legislation. So across these 5 elements, these 5 regulation legislations, you'll be able to start seeing the roadmap of your specific product in a European environment. On the US front, you have the Federal Food, Drugs, and Cosmetic Act that has a specific section in relation to biologics. You also have 21 CRF 1271, which is not specific to ATMPs, but it guides you through how to start generating your designation for biological medical devices. And last but not least, you also have to consider 21 CRF parts 607 and 207, will give you more information in relation to blood and blood derivative legislations. And again, across these 4 elements of regulation legislation in the US, hopefully you will have some indication of where your product falls under to allow you to start discussions with health authorities and build up your drug development plan. In the first slides on screen now, basically this is the committee that governs ATMPs here in Europe. This committee has expanded greatly over the last few years. It governs anything related to advanced therapies, and their main objectives are these 5. So basically, they assist you with developing of documentation in order to ensure that your product does fall within ATMP category and what regulations are impacted by that classification. He also certifies quality and non-clinical data for SMEs to develop in these ATMPs, provides support to train assessors, because not all the time health authorities have those assessors readily available to be able to review your documentation. So CAT comes and trains those assessors and then organizes scientific workshops as the one required, provides scientific recommendations for the classification of ATMPs, as we just discussed a minute ago, and contributes for the scientific advice. If you choose to seek that scientific advice, this is the committee that will be able to be the conveyor of where you need to direct your questions, how best to direct your questions, what legislation you need to guide your questions through, and so forth. In US, you have the Office for Tissue and Advanced Therapies, OTP, and this main office then brings on board other offices that have more specific objectives as part of their overall needs. So you have the Office of Review of Management of Regulatory Reviews. You have the Office of Gene Therapy for Chemistry, Manufacturing Control. So anything related to CMC, this will be the office that will provide you guidance. Office for Cellular Therapy and Human Tissue, CMC may also be brought in to provide support and assessment. You have the Office for Plasma and Protein Therapeutical, CMC, the Office for Pharmacologic and Toxicologic Activities, and the Office for Clinical Evaluation. So a little bit of a pause there. So as you've seen for the EU, you have one committee that brings all the assessors in order to support you with your drug product development. In the US, it's a lot more fragmented. So they have different offices, not necessarily assessors, that actually contribute to the overall of your drug development as a whole. And on the next slide, you will see that a lot of what we just discussed now. So you have CAT, Committee for Advanced Therapies. It's responsible for reviewing the applications, responsible for classification, certification, scientific advisory meetings. So this is the office that will give you your first support. Again, if you choose to seek that support, which is always recommended. You have CHMP, which will be responsible at a later stage, will be responsible for elaborating the agency's opinions. So they are the ones that will then bring experts in order to assess your dossier, to provide input. They'll probably be the ones that will be asking questions throughout the clinical trials, throughout the MAs that you end up submitting. And then at the end, you will have the European Commission, which is the authorized body for all centralized authorized products that takes, they are the ones that take the legal binding decision. So in EU, you will have this order of contact with CAT, with CHMP and EC. But CAT is there throughout the process to be able to support you with that development and submission of documentation throughout. In US, you have CBER, which is responsible for ensuring the safety, purity, potency, and efficacy of your submissions, your ATMP submissions. You have OTAT, which is an office that comprises of numerous divisions, as you've seen on the previous slide, and they pretty much coordinate who needs to participate on the review. Is that another group that needs to be brought in, because now you have discussed additional CMC components that were not discussed earlier. So between CBER and OTAT, they'll be able to counterbalance the support that you will need throughout the discussions that you will have with them on scientific advisory meetings. Right at the end, you will have FDA, and they are the ones that in essence will approve your BLA as the one you go through the process of the BLA. ATMP's regulatory framework is relatively straightforward. So you have in EU, you have Directive 2003/63. They govern not only ATMPs and the subset of the ATMP medicinal products, they govern other products, as I've highlighted here on the 3 boxes at the bottom. But for the purpose of this webinar, we are going to be focusing on how they govern advanced therapeutical medicine products. In US, you have CRF Title 21. And again, this CRF does not govern just gene therapy products and cellular products, but they also govern blood products, antibodies, therapeutical serums, and so forth and so forth. So it's only a subset of the CFR that actually governs cellular and gene therapies. In terms of definition, I maybe pause there for a second to highlight that although you might have just one product manufactured in just one site, in just one country, so everything is unique as far as the CMC side of things, you might actually end up having different classifications between US and EU, because there are differences in how US and EU regulations actually see advanced gene therapy products. And the purpose of the next 3 to 4 slides is to actually highlight where you actually might start seeing the differences. Ideally, you would have one global dossier, one global product, one classification, and that's what you'll see in a lot of more mainstream medicines, small molecules, for example, where possibly you'll have one product that is a global product. You might actually end up having different classifications depending on the guidances that you have in EU and US. So in EU, you have Annex 1, Part 5, related to Directive 2003/63, which governs gene therapy products. And the definition that you see on screen is literally verbatim to what's on this directive, which is genes that lead to therapeutic, prophylactic, or diagnostic effects. They work for inserting recombinant genes into the body. So pretty much verbatim. In the US, as part of CRF Title 21, you have a slightly different interpretation. They go beyond, so administration of genetic materials to modify or manipulate the expression of gene products and to alter the biological properties of living cells for therapeutical use, prevention, treatment, or cure of a disease of condition of human beings. So it's a lot more detailed and a lot more specific than you will have in the EU. There is other subcategories. So you also have in the EU part of the same directive with the addition of regulation 1394/2007. You also can consider your pod might be a somatic cell therapy medicinal products, maybe a tissue engineer medicinal products. And again, these definitions are verbatim to what you have in the directive. On the other side of the equation, you have the US, which again, still governed by the same guidelines, same regulations as gene therapies. But in this case, you only have cell therapy products. And then you have a group that encompasses a lot more, not specifically grouped together type of cells. So you can have autologous, allogenic, or xenogenic cells. So either cells that are retrieved from the patient and then returned back to the patient. You can have allogenic cells, which will have a donor, a human donor that will go back to a specific patient, or you can have xenogenic cells, which is cells that come from an animal, let us say a pig, for example, and then get input into the patient. And they depending on what type of cells, they might be classified slightly different, but at its core, these cells have to be propagated, expanded, selected, pharmacologically speaking, treat or otherwise alter the biological characteristic and ex vivo, and they have therapeutical, diagnostic, or preventative purposes. So again, you see that there is a lot more descriptions and definitions on the US side than you see on the EU side. On the next few slides, I go in a little bit more detail about these different type of cells. So we already touched base on somatic cells and tissue engineering cells. They're not the same. They have specific classifications in EU. And both class of products share the same inclusion principle, that the tissue needs to be minimally, barely manipulated or engineered, and the difference lays on the indication. So this is why it is always important to seek advice, because your interpretation of that differentiation might give you a different classification. Your interpretation of how that indication is imposed on the product also might have different classification. So at the beginning of any discussions with CAT, it's always important to say, this is what we believe our product is because of, and you provide a justification as to why you feel it falls in that category. And it will then be the CAT assessors that they are brought on board in order to assess your product. They will be able to give you confirmation that your classification is correct. And we'll touch base on the classification in a few minutes as well. For the US, cell and tissue-based products can be subcategorized even further. Again, you've seen the trend that the US provides a lot more subcategories and a lot more definition on the ATMPs versus what you have in the EU. So you can have cell tissues and cellular and tissue-based products. These are articles that contain or consist of human cells or tissues that are intended for the implantation, transplantation, infusion, or transfer into a human recipient. They are also minimally manipulated and have a homologous use. ATMPs and these human cell tissue and cellular-based products are not the same. They are more, ATMPs are tissues and cells and cellular and tissue-based products, but they are less manipulated and are intended for non-homologous use. I keep on talking about manipulation. And again, this is a very big leverage point that you will need to consider when developing your ATMP development program. How much manipulation has your product incurred? There is actually definitions on both EU and US to define manipulation. So the concept of manipulation in EU is classed as, or is referred to as, a substantial manipulation, where you actually have change of the biological, physiological, function, structural properties of the donor cells, regardless of what those donor cells are. So you actually significantly manipulate those properties. And on the other side of the equation, you have the US, where they literally state that minimum manipulation. When they're talking about manipulation, they're talking about more than minimal. You barely do anything to your cells. So they remain most, if not all, of their biological, physiological, and structural properties. And this is where you start. Hopefully you are now starting to see that what I was saying right at the beginning of the webinar, where you might have exactly the same product. In this case, you could manipulate the product in one way, and you might see it as a substantial manipulation. So therefore, they will have your ATMP classification. And if the US feels that, okay, you manipulated it too much under our guidance, then we wouldn't be able to class that as a cell therapy, then we might be considering another type of classification or designation. We also touch base on homologous use. So there is also definition in both EU and US that specifically describe homologous use. So in EU, these are cells and tissues that are used to maintain the original functions or in the same anatomical and histological environment. So again, there is no change to what their function is on the same environment. But then in US, there is further differentiation between structural and non-structural tissues. So repair, reconstruction, replacement, or supplementation of recipient cells or tissues within a HCT environment, basically, that performs the same basic functions. So you again, similar way that you've seen on the previous slide, that EU and US are seeing manipulation differently. The same applies for homologous use. They're also seeing that there is a difference between they are differentiating and how they actually see this use. I've touched base on classifications and designations in the last 2 or 3 slides. So in the EU, we call it ATMP classification. In US, we call it request for designation. The terminology is slightly different, but the same principle applies in a lot of ways. Basically, you classify or designate your product under a specific classification. Is always important at this earlier stage of development to seek that formal classification. you don't want to go down the path of going through thousands of pounds or dollars and realize that actually you have made the incorrect classification or designation internally at your company. You didn't seek advice through the relevant bodies, and then it end up being the case that you have actually not aligned yourself to what the health authorities are considering your product should fall under, and then you have to scrap everything and go back to zero. So it's, again, very important that early stages of ATMP development, you seek that formal classification and initiate your discussions with your relevant health authorities. In EU, the EMA has established a procedure to address the questions on this borderline classification. Some products, you might have a product in specific that it's a given, is a tissue engineered. It's obviously somatic cell therapy. There are products that are very clear to be classified, others not so much. So they actually have established a procedure to address, okay, if you are on this borderline, you're not sure what process they followed. And this is where CAT comes to play. So they are the ones that you would approach. You would say, I have this product and I want to ensure that I have a formal classification from you. And they actually deliver that recommendation and give you that ATMP classification. In US, same principle applies. The earliest, the better that you can approach the relevant office within FDA to actually get that designation in place. There is a process that you need to follow in order to determine of the regulatory entity of the product, if it is a drug, medical device, and so forth. So you go through that initial process, but then you have the OCT, which assigns the review responsibilities for, depending on which office your product will fall under, and at the end they will give you that designation that indeed you have a gene therapy, you have a tissue engineered, regardless. So then you have your classification that you'll be able to follow through to the next steps of your development. I'll keep on coming back to the point that how important it is to start discussions with your health authorities at early stages of your development. There is informal meetings and formal meetings that you can choose to go down the pathway of initiating with either EU and US. So for the EU, you have informal meetings. There is an innovation task force at EMA that you'll be able to contact and get discussions going. You can also request informal meetings with NCA. Again, most of the time they actually coordinate between the two of them. There's also a possibility to ask for joint IFT and NCA meetings. But then as you go through your development plan, you may have to consider a more formal scientific advice. Normally in EU, you start with informal because first and foremost, on informal meetings, you don't have fees to pay. When you come to scientific advisory meetings, you do. And as I said before, at any stage of your drug development plan for ATMPs, you have a relatively open door policy to ask for support from your health authorities. You also have the equivalent happening in US, different groups. So informally, you can reach out to Interact, which is the initial target engagement for regulatory advice. Is a team that deals with not only ATMPs, but other type of products, but you can reach out to them and ask for their support. It's a team, or it's a group within FDA. At some point in time, then you need to consider your pre-IND meetings. Again, this is very broad across other drug development plans, but in specific to ATMPs, you go down the same pathway. You approach FDA, you ask for the different type of meetings. You have type A, type B, type C. They recently have changed the the type of meetings that you can seek advice on, but it's not dissimilar to what you normally do when you develop the type of products. It's just different because on their end, they will bring specific ATMP assessors in order to support the questions that you may have for FDA. In this slide, I have added, because whilst you go through your drug development plan, you also need to consider your orphan drug designations. So more often than not, ATMPs are brought in, are developed for specific needs. A lot of them have orphan drug designation associated to them, something that you can discuss with whatever health authority you're dealing with, depending if it is EU and US. Is this something that we need to consider? Is this product targeting a specific set of therapeutical indications that are target for orphan diseases? And if the answer is yes, you may need to consider orphan drug designation for your ATMP as well. In the similarity to what I just said for orphan drug designations, you also need to consider, is your ATMP targeting a pediatric population? If the answer is yes, either depending if you are in EU or US or targeting EU and US, there is different stages of your drug development that you can consider bringing this to discussions with health authorities. So in EU, you have this single pediatric regulation that covers all pediatric investigation plans. It's not specific to ATMP. And normally you bring this to the table for discussion with health authorities at the end of phase 1. And I think it's important to mention as well that there is no waiver or exemption of ODTs in the EU. For the US, you have the pediatric rule, which is still standing, although it's from 1988. You also had the Pediatric Research Equity Act, more recent, from 2003. Both of these govern all PSPs filed and supported by the US. You normally bring PSPs to discussions with the health authorities a little bit later versus what we have in EU, normally at the end of phase 2. And in US, there's an exemption of ODTs except for cancer indications. In relation to clinical trials and different clinical trials concepts, so the similarity across both regions and pretty much globally is that you still have to go through the sequential order for phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. That doesn't change. Most of you hopefully will be familiar with the process of filing for clinical trials. There are differences between EU and US. Most recently in EU, we now have EU CTR in place, and everything gets submitted through CETA, so is quite harmonized at this moment in time. I think for the last 3 years, we've been using EU CTR now. So the same process will apply for ATMPs. So if you have an ATMP, you still need to use EU CTR as your guidance regulation. In US, you have the Code for Federal Regulation 21, Part 312, and it also governs the whole of your clinical trial development for your ATMP. So there is nothing specific as far as clinical trials are concerned. So if you are familiar with clinical trials for other products, the same principle applies. There might be considerations that the health authorities will ask you to consider when you actually come to make the summation of your protocols for assessment and so forth, which might be a little bit more specific with ATMPs. But in terms of process of submission, the clinical trials process that you have for other type of medicinal products still stands. once you've gone through your discussions with health authorities, once you've gone through your clinical trials, at some point in time, you start thinking, okay, now as the clinical trials are almost wrapping up, we need to actually start getting the information for how do I now build my BLA or my MA application. So again, very similar to where you have as far as structure is concerned. So both will be on ACTD format. ATMPs in EU are evaluated via centralized procedure. We have made a mention of this a few slides ago. This centralized MA is recommended by the EMA and is granted by the EC, again, as we discussed earlier. And as far as approval is concerned, you can have your standard, your conditional, or under exceptional circumstances, depending the urgent need of your product to reach population. And for the US, we have BLAs that are used not only for ATMPs, but also for biologicals. All medicines are evaluated at centralized level. The BLA is granted by the FDA. But in this case, there's only two types of approvals. Either you have your standard approval or your accelerated. If you were to equal US and EU at this stage, the conditional or under exceptional circumstances in EU will equal the accelerated approval that you would have in US. So basically it comes down to how urgent it is to actually get your product on the market. These are the discussions that you can have with your health authority, even before you submit either the MA or the BLA, to let them expedite the process of approval of your product to reach the market. Which leads me nicely to the next slide. So there are expedited development plans. They are gaining a little bit more traction, both at EU and US level. There is discussions happening between EU and US in order to support these expedited plans. We are actually seeing they are meeting up to see what programs is the EU doing that maybe US could actually be considering, and vice versa. They're also recognizing that there's a lot of products out there that have this urgent need to get to market. How can they actually work together to get this product to market to patients as soon as possible? Eligible medicines, as we discussed before, are those that can justify a potential major public health interest. Again, the urgent medical needs to patients will play a very vital role here, and it's down to you as the sponsor of the clinical trials and AMA holder to actually support that. But if you open your discussions at a later stage with health authorities, they'll be able to advise you if there is an expedited program that you might be able to leverage on in order to get your approval faster. The ones that are currently in place, you have a prime designation in the EU, which is the development of medicines that target an unmet medical needs and can be applied during early stages of development. So right at the beginning, if you can justify to the health authority that you do have a product that has this unmet urgent medical needs, they'll be able to put you into a faster approval program. This is the only one that we have in EU. In US, you can have breakthrough therapy, fast track designation, or regenerative medicine designation. The prime designation in EU and the breakthrough therapy in US are very similar. And again, they are US and EU health authorities are working together in order to not to be too dissimilar of how they actually get the product to market, and to actually come out with very similar outcomes of those development plans. You can also choose fast track designations in US, which is development drugs which treats a serious or life-threatening condition and fill unmet medical needs. And you can have RMAT, which is for drugs intended to the treatment, modification, reverse, or cure of a serious or life-threatening disease or condition. And again, as I said many times before, approach your health authorities right at the beginning of the development, and they'll be able to advise you if there is an open door there for your specific product, because that has been, you can justify that actually there is an unmet need there. And just to wrap up, this is the slide that I've shown you right at the beginning of the call. So if you glance over at the slide, you'll be able to see that I've taken you through the whole of the steps that you need to consider when developing your ATMP drug development program, right from contact from health authorities throughout the development process on both sides, EU and US. I guide you through the designation requests or ATMP classification, which is a case of, this is the classification that we're proposing. Are you in agreement? The different type of meetings that you can have at EU and US level, they'll be able to give you the guidance. Considerations that you need to have. Do I have an orphan drug or not? Do I need to apply for orphan drug designation or not? Same goes for PSPs and PIPs. Considerations that you need to have when you come to do the registration. Either you have a BLA or MA in order to make your filing to health authorities for approval. And also the considerations that you can have if you actually want to bring your ATMP to market faster. If you can justify either via Prime or via the three accelerated programs that US have, that you indeed have a product that meets this medical needs that you currently have on a specific population, on a wider population. And I believe that was the last slide on my end, so I will hand over back to Maurice.
Thank you, Katja. Thank you for this nice overview, nice legislative overview of PGTs and ATMPs. Before we go into Q&A, I want to point everybody towards our next webinars. In May, we will present on regulatory trends in 2025, and then in July, actually the second one of the cell and gene therapy series, and we'll do a deep dive into the CMC for these kind of products. So now, without further ado, I want to open it up for Q&A, and we do actually have one sort of clarifying question in our Q&A tab. So, Katja, earlier in your presentation, you spoke about Directive 2001/63 EC and Annex 1 Part 5, while on your slides you had Part 4. Is it, just to clarify and make it more clear for everybody, is it Annex 1 to Part 4 or Annex 1 to Part 5?
It is more specifically Part 5.
Okay.
There is some information on Part 4, but is on that portion that I was referring to is more specifically Part 5. Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Then, while we wait, when anybody has a question and doesn't want to type in the Q&A tab, please raise your hand and we can unmute your for a moment to ask a question. Until that happens, Katja, what I was thinking of, you have certain types of cell and gene therapies. When you test them in a clinical trial, you need to follow the patients for 5 years after the trial, and for other types, 15 years. Can you explain where that difference is coming from in relation to the regulations? In relation to regulation, it actually comes down more to the assessment of your specific product, and more from the clinical side of the assessment of your product. So, and your clinical SMEs will be able to give me more information on that. But if for your specific, and varies from therapeutical indication. So if there's a specific indication that your specific disease does not present itself as readily as, I don't know if I'm explaining this correctly, but your physicians might actually say, actually, we might not see the outcome of this therapy for 5 years or 15 years. So that date of the clinical trial comes down to how the patients for that particular indication react to the usage of that particular indication. So it's not a regulatory imposed timeline, it's a clinical therapeutical indication timeline. It comes down to how the patients develop. You have some degenerative medicines that within and in patients, so you actually see the patients, Alzheimer's unfortunately being one of them. Some patients, they get diagnosed, they have Alzheimer's, and you actually don't see them, the side effects actually come through for 5, 10, 20 years, or at all. They got diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but they barely have the indication of having Alzheimer's. Unfortunately, in other patients, you actually see that it escalates a lot faster. So it depends on what the clinician advises that you actually need to put in place in order to more clinically be able to evaluate how your product interacts with those particular patients. No two patients are the same. No two therapeutical conditions are the same. A lot of these diseases, unfortunately, are genetic. So they don't demonstrate the same genetic pathway and the same side effects and so forth. So it comes down to the actual advice of the clinicians of how the medicine develops throughout the life cycle of the patient, basically.
Okay, thank you. We have another question in the tab. Is it possible that slides will be shared after the presentation? I think we mentioned that we're going to share the recording rather than the slides, but the recording will have all the information that is captured on the slides.
Perfect.
Any more questions, please raise your hands or type them in the Q&A tab.
Maybe a point from my end, just to bridge to what you said earlier, Maurice, about the CMC and what's on the screen now, about the deep dive into the CMC for ATMPs and gene and cell therapy products. So I will be presenting that webinar as well. And if some of you are interested in the difficulties and the stumbling blocks and the lessons learned of your CMC development plan, hopefully you'll join us on the 2nd of July.
Yes, thank you for that, Katja.
Okay. Perfect. I think that is it at my end, Maurice.
I'll give another 2 minutes for people to take an opportunity to ask a question before we close the session for today. So in the meantime, Katja, is anything mentioned in the regulation about shedding? I heard that shedding can happen, so that means that probably with a viral ATMP, you administer it to a subject or patient, and virus particles can get shed and can get into the environment. Does it have a huge impact on the environmental risk assessment for that product?
There is nothing specific in guidance at this moment in time. So that's not a guidance that I can redirect you to. However, I have worked with a couple of products now where there was specific questions on this point to say, okay, your product is getting to the environment. ERAs are there to monitor across all medicinal products, but there's a lot more interest from health authorities now because of the type of products, because they actually alter, they naturally manipulate. I think that was the wording that one of the EMA assessors mentioned in the scientific advisory meeting previously. They naturally manipulate animals in their normal environments. There were even concerns about effects on fish if ATMPs get into the water and alter the environment some way, somehow. So I wouldn't be surprised that in years to come, you will actually have, and I'm talking about relatively 5-10 years, that you actually see something specific on ERAs, maybe not a specific guidelines related to environmental risk assessment for ATMPs, but something within environmental risk assessment guidance that has a subsection for ATMPs to say that there is further considerations that needs to take place, because there is this natural manipulation that takes place within the environment. So how do we monitor this? Do we need to do something before manufacturing sites discard of affluent waste? What happens when it goes through human bodies? So I think something more specific is coming in the near future, but there is nothing at this moment in time. There's nothing specific on either ATMP environmental risk assessment ATMPs, nor there is nothing specific on the general environmental risk assessment guidances that says for ATMPs you need to consider this, this, and this. But health authorities may ask you, okay, have you considered this? And maybe they are gathering intel to be able to say, okay, this is something that we need to consider at health authorities, at health authority level.
Okay, so thank you, Katja, and thank you again for delivering this nice webinar. In the meantime, we have not received any further questions, so I propose that we close the webinar for today, and we hope to see all of you, or most of you, again in one of our future webinars, and certainly on the one on the 2nd of July, covering the deep dive into the CMC. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
And have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.